Thank you for having me along today to talk about gender sensitive planning and design. Before I get started, I'll just quickly share how I became interested in this subject. So over the last few years, I'd become aware that different genders have different needs from a city, but I didn't really understand why this was or what these different needs were. Then about a year ago, I read a book called Invisible Woman by Caroline Criado Perez, and it just really opened my eyes to what some of these issues are. And once my eyes had been opened, I couldn't ignore it. So I dug a bit deeper and things have sort of progressed from there. And I quickly found that most information that's currently available is from Europe. So a key part of my process was finding out how Christchurch residents compare to gender data that's being collected overseas. And it turns out that the trends are pretty similar. So my knowledge in this area is constantly evolving, particularly since I've started my PhD. And the purpose of this presentation today is just to share a little bit of what I've learned so far and how this relates to planning and design. So I'll just quickly run through why do we need to worry about gender sensitive design, look at some gender data and its impacts on our use of the city, look at how can these impacts be addressed through planning and design, and then what can we do. So New Zealand has made international commitments to eliminate discrimination against women. In 1985, New Zealand ratified the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination against Women. We are also subject to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which includes gender equality. So when it comes to design and planning, we know that there are a range of important lenses to be applied, such as accessibility and cultural lenses, and we're becoming much more familiar with these. However, there is also a growing body of knowledge that people of different genders have different needs, and the design of a city and its transport systems impact on whether or not these needs are met. So these different needs arise because of varying work and travel patterns, sense of safety, activities, and caregiver roles. And these differences reflect a range of circumstances. So, for example, this image reflects a two-parent household where one works full-time and the other works part-time, as well as undertaking the unpaid household tasks. Anyone with children will probably recognise this scenario. And as you can see, their daily movements are very different. And when transport systems and city design don't recognise these differences, it makes people's lives harder. So the changes required to better cater for women will also benefit other groups in society. So as such, it's my belief that if women and the broader spectrum of genders are taken into account, this will not only benefit gender diversity, but all those in deprived households, those who work part-time, those who undertake unpaid care work, those with mobility issues, children and the elderly. So in this section, I'm going to illustrate some of the gender gaps that affect our use of the city and how city planning and design doesn't always address these gaps. It's worth noting that current data doesn't capture all of the issues relating to gender in the city. Not all information is split by gender, and where it is, it doesn't tend to cover the full range of the full spectrum of genders that exist. And because of this, the following data and examples primarily reflect the binary genders of men and women. So women do the majority of unpaid care work. In New Zealand, 65% of female work is unpaid, compared to 37% of male work. In fact, not wanting to cast aspersions, but in the 2018 census, the only unpaid activity that men did more than women was the no activity category. Unpaid work includes looking after children and sick or elderly relatives, managing the household. This generally involves accompanying others to appointments and activities and making short trips to multiple locations, as well as trying to incorporate paid work into their day. Research indicates that Māori tend to have higher levels of care responsibilities than Pākehā due to larger families and kaitiaki obligations, and this is further impacted by health inequities that are experienced by Māori. Traditionally, this work has been seen as a woman's role, and a recent New Zealand study shows that even we're in a household where women are better educated, earn more and work more than their male partner, they will still undertake about 50% more household serving trips. And when you consider that 44% of the Christchurch population consists of children, young or elderly people, and that nearly a quarter of the New Zealand population identify as disabled. That's a lot of care work going on. And the less independent these groups are, the more unpaid care work is required. And if the main caregiver also doesn't have access to the dominant form of transport, being a car, then that level of burden is increased. So as a result of all this unpaid care work that needs doing, only 40% of women in Christchurch work full-time, and a whopping 36% of women aren't in the workforce at all. Of all part-time workers in New Zealand, 71% of them are women. The women who are able to work continue to earn less than men. So the New Zealand gender pay gap ranges between 7 and 17%, depending on the industry. However, the gender pay gap is actually 38% when based on median actual income. So that's a huge gap. The significance of this is that women have less discretionary income. So this affects things like travel mode options, level of independence, participation in recreation and other activities, and ability to save for their retirement, thereby further reducing their independence later in life. Women also are faced with a number of threats, such as sexual harassment, sexual assault, and the resulting fears for their safety that come from this. And fear impacts on a woman's free movement and basic right of access to the city. Only half of females in Christchurch feel safe walking in their neighbourhoods after dark, and nearly 3/4 of New Zealand women have experienced harassment while on public transport or in public spaces. This can be even harder for other groups. While it's common for some women to use strategies such as headphones and sunglasses to make themselves less visible, for women of colour, the issue can be an inescapable visibility. An Auckland study found that Māori and migrant women feel less safe than Pākehā women when waiting for public transport. And another study found that the most significant concern for Māori was people danger and neighbourhood safety when it came to children cycling. Trans and non-binary people feel unsafe at rates that are similar to women, but they're at least 4 times more likely to experience discrimination on the street or in public. These fears prevent women, trans and non-binary people from taking public transport, from being able to take shortcuts, or even just enjoy walking around their city after dark. Women and girls have different barriers to moving around the city. So studies in New Zealand and overseas show that women are more likely than men to walk or take public transport. In a city designed for cars, infrastructure for these transport options are not adequate to meet women's needs. And this makes it more difficult to move around the city, thereby placing more burden on their time and reducing time available for work or leisure. Despite women being more likely to use public transport, bus routes and timetables are focused on commuters, whereas women are more likely to travel locally, outside of peak times when frequency is lower and waiting times are longer. This diagram that we saw earlier shows the difference between linear travel and trip chaining travel patterns. Trip chaining becomes even more difficult for deprived households. Only half of Christchurch residents feel that they have enough money to meet their basic needs, and 29% of Māori living in deprived areas are from households with no motor vehicle. All of this points to the fact that focusing on infrastructure for cars and commuters disadvantages those who rely on or would prefer to use other forms of transport. Males and females tend to use public spaces differently. So this in part stems from feelings of safety and comfort, and also from different activity preferences. Issues of safety mean that men are more likely to be present and active in public spaces. For example, in Sweden, 80% of people using what they've termed spontaneous activity grounds are men. In regards to children, studies show that girls' presence in parks and playgrounds drops significantly from the age of 10. And trials in New Zealand, Sweden and Austria have found that girls prefer informal games, can feel intimidated in a larger space that's dominated by boys, and that youth spaces tend to focus on male activities such as skate parks and basketball courts. So in New Zealand, basketball courts, skate parks and bike tracks are increasingly installed to meet the recreation needs of children and youth. However, these statistics show that these elements cater more to boys than to girls. In New Zealand, only 31% of school-age kids playing basketball are girls, and 88% of skate park users in an Auckland study were male. However, it's worth noting that volleyball is becoming increasingly popular for girls and is the 4th most popular sport in the country just now. 64% of secondary school players are girls. This is a graphic from the Contemporary Atlas of New Zealand and gives a really good snapshot of the level of freedom and ability to move around Christchurch depending on your level of income and physical mobility. So this looked at three Christchurch women, and the first woman in orange, she's mid-30s, married with 2 children. Ready access to transport and disposable income means that she's able to take her children to a range of activities. She can shop at specialist grocery stores, take advantage of sales and shopping in different parts of the city. The second woman in green is mid-50s. She has 4 adult children and lives without a partner with her 13-year-old son who suffers from impairments. She's unable to work and cannot afford a car, so is forced to use amenities within walking distance to her house or to take the bus if she wants to go into town. She is able to go shopping with her daughter once a week to a mall further away from home, but she doesn't have much freedom outside of school hours. And then the third lady in blue is a widow in her 70s, and she lives with her daughter and son-in-law. Her only income is her superannuation. She is housebound due to heart problems and failing eyesight and a series of small strokes. She never learned to drive and cannot make use of public transport, so she's reliant on others to take her on outings. So these are 3 very different experiences for 3 women living in the same city. In summary, the factors of unpaid work, the gender pay gap, feelings of safety, transport barriers and activity preferences all affect transport choices, access to public space, level of physical activity, earning ability and level of independence. So cities can and should be designed for everyone. As Jane Jacobs put it, cities have the capability of providing something for everyone, only because and only when they are created by everybody. Traditionally, transport systems, town planning and public spaces were designed by men for men. Not intentionally, but because they assumed that what was good for them would probably be good for everyone else as well. This has resulted in cities that work best for those who work full-time and have no unpaid caregiving roles. And this group does consist of all genders, but data shows that men make up the majority of this group. To address this, I believe we need to start applying gender mainstreaming to our work. So gender-sensitive design sits under the wider concept of gender mainstreaming, which involves applying a gender lens to all policies, planning, budgeting decisions and design projects. In other words, rather than assuming that all actions and decisions will affect genders equally, we intentionally analyse the potential effects on different genders. And this concept isn't new. Vienna has been practising gender mainstreaming since 1992. There are a lot of examples where gender mainstreaming principles have been successfully implemented, and I'll go through some of those now. In Vienna in 1997, the first housing development designed around the needs of women was implemented through a commission where only female architects were invited to respond. At this time, female architects weren't being invited to submit proposals for housing developments. So the key objective of the design was for it to support women in their caregiving tasks and their housework and family chores. So it achieved this in a number of ways. They selected a site that's close to public transport and amenities. A childcare and doctor's surgery was integrated into the development. It has a car-free central space, keeping it safe for children. Car zones prioritise pedestrians, and children's play spaces were also integrated into the development. So following this, other similar developments also continued, and now every housing development in Vienna must meet women's needs. Linked to this is Vienna's principle of a city of short distances, the idea that jobs, shops, open spaces, schools and homes are in close proximity. This supports the demands of daily life for families, but also for young, elderly and those in lower socioeconomic groups. This also encourages the use of active transport because with amenities located where people live and safer streets mean that more people can travel independently. The European Union published a policy note in 2014 called Gender Equality and Mobility Mind the Gap. The policy note recognises that transport policies should be adapted to support women's mobility needs and that improving accessibility, safety and comfort of transportation modes are key to this. The policy note proposes that meeting women's transport needs will also support more environmentally friendly development due to women being more likely to adopt sustainable travel behaviours, and this is also supported by research in New Zealand. A number of initiatives have been implemented to support women's transport needs, particularly in Europe. So, for example, there are pink taxis dedicated to women at night at discounted rates, and female-only parking areas that are accessible, well-lit and near exits. For those using public transport, a wide range of systems have been incorporated, such as reducing the distance women need to walk at night by allowing buses to stop between bus stops, making it free to ride public transport if you have a pushchair, and providing frequent services where women don't have to wait too long for public transport to show up. And for walkers and cyclists, the need is recognised for separated cycleways, a shift of priorities for slower road users, and a close-knit, walkable and barrier-free network. All these initiatives make it easier and safer for people to travel around their towns and cities. Here in New Zealand, Timaru is trialling a new bus system called My Way, which uses minibuses to provide an on-demand bus service. It's a flexible service that can be booked for a specific time via an app and makes use of existing and virtual bus stops to reduce walking distances. This service has already increased accessibility and community connection of Timaru residents. It can make trip chaining by public transport much easier and pick up and drop off easier for those with mobility issues. It's currently being offered from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, but if this was extended, it would also increase safety for people travelling at night. The service has already been implemented in 20 other countries across 5 continents. Separated cycleways. A recent New Zealand study found that women make significantly more motorised trips of less than 5 kilometres than men each day. This is likely to reflect the requirement to accompany others, making cycling or walking less suitable with current infrastructure. Women with children in their household are much less likely to bike than those without children, and women report greater safety concerns and stronger preferences for separated cycleways. This makes sense when you look at these photos that a parent with a child is unlikely to bike on a busy street, but is much more likely to take a child on a separated cycleway. We know that more women than men cycle in cities that are designed with protected cycleways and low-speed streets, for example, Netherlands, Germany and Denmark. Christchurch also illustrates this trend, with female cyclists in Christchurch increasing by 9% in the 4 years following the implementation of major cycleways. However, even these cycleways still prioritise the commuter trip and don't consider the needs of different ethnic groups. For example, in an Auckland cycling study, it was found that more Māori women prefer to travel in groups rather than cycle on their own, an activity that isn't supported by existing infrastructure. And Māori women were also more likely to be in a multi-generational group when out biking. The City of Vienna redesigned 2 parks to align them better to girls' interests and to raise feelings of safety in the park. This was based on research by female planning experts and sociologists. They created some smaller spaces and introduced seating areas for girls to hang out with friends, areas to play informal games and observe other activities. The result of this was increased participation of girls in public spaces, and the city is now applying this strategy in all 23 districts of its city. The ability for girls to travel safely to these spaces further impacts on their participation in parks and playgrounds. In Sweden, they provided a soccer court for girls to increase girls' participation. The court is named Aslani Court after a female soccer star that grew up in the area. At many courts, boys have the best time slots, but at Aslani Court, while boys are welcome, girls have the best time slots. As a result of the project, the sport now has a higher status for girls, the place is safer, and it's much more lively with both boys and girls using the courts. In New Zealand, studies and news articles show that girls and women feel intimidated when using facilities such as skate parks and bike tracks. A female Auckland skateboarder stopped skating for 6 years due to pressure from boys, and even now still gets aggression from other users. To combat this, she's running beginner sessions for girls to encourage them to give it a go and to feel safe, and other similar activities have been organised as well. In Christchurch, we've managed to raise funds to put in a pink basketball court to encourage more girls to use it. While I acknowledge that pink is stereotypical, it creates a clear message when we're trying to change attitudes about these spaces. So feedback from school-age girls regarding this idea so far has been really positive, and the local women's basketball team is keen to run some girls' events and activate the court and increase participation, which is really exciting. There are plenty of design guides and guidance documents out there to assist us in incorporating gender mainstreaming into our everyday work. They contain criteria and other guidance to assist us with design, planning and policy development to ensure they're appropriate to all genders. The New Zealand Ministry for Women tool specifically assists with including gender in policy development. A good example of this in action is from Sweden. A few years ago, the city of Karlskoga reviewed all of their policies through a gender lens. One employee made the comment that at least we can be sure that snow ploughing won't be a gender issue. But they soon found out that this was not exactly the case. When they reviewed their ploughing policy, they discovered that the first roads to be cleared were the main roads leading to the city, benefiting commuters, mostly men. Footpaths were last to be cleared, not so good for pedestrians who were very often women and children. They then discovered that 79% of pedestrian injuries actually occur in the winter, and 69% of those were women. So it was actually a gendered issue after all. And following this review, the city began clearing their footpaths first. This decreased pedestrian accidents by half, as well as the added bonus of saving the government millions of kroner of healthcare costs. The Women's Safety Audit Tool was built on the concept of CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. The tool is used by a range of groups to highlight different gender perceptions as part of planning and designing safer public spaces. This tool is carried out by female users of a space. Women consider matters such as how many women are in the space, are they inhabiting it, or quickly passing through with their keys as a ready weapon. Women inhabiting a space makes a big difference to perceptions of safety and to the sense that women are entitled to take up space in public. Digital platforms such as SafetyPin and Free2Be allow women to use apps to pinpoint precisely where they feel safe, unsafe, and why. They are increasingly useful for local governments as they merge traditional CPTED strategies with a gender lens. Free2Be facilitated a youth-led safety walk in Sydney in 2018. The girls took key stakeholders on a walk around the city and led activities based on young women's stories. This was really useful in helping participants identify how their work can influence the experiences of women and girls. The Christchurch City Council's Smart Cities team is currently developing one of these systems for Christchurch, and we're actually presenting this to the executive leadership team this afternoon. This will be the first one of these systems operated by a council. They provide a range of benefits for the user, including the ability to plan their route based on other people's comments, and it provides a platform to report unsafe feelings that can't normally be reported because nothing's actually happened yet. And for the council, we can proactively address unsafe areas and learn from the positive entries that people put on there as well. The police are also really supportive of this tool and the information that it can provide to help them. Gender budgeting initiative. Gender budgeting identifies expenditure that is likely to have a positive or negative effect on a particular gender. Another example from Sweden, they reviewed how their annual sports funding was allocated and discovered that more of the funding was going to male-oriented sports, meaning that female sports effectively received less funding. So this meant that girls often had to pay privately to play their preferred sports, assuming they could afford it. Some sports preferred by girls weren't run at all due to a lack of funding, and there was a reduced participation in sports by girls and women. Other funding decisions that can affect genders differently include the types of transport infrastructure that's prioritised, levels of travel subsidies, levels of funding to upgrade streets and public space, which neighbourhoods are prioritised, and which types of recreation facilities are prioritised. Gender-responsive procurement is the selection of services, goods and civil works that consider their impact on gender equality and women's empowerment. An example of this would be the commissioning of housing developments in Vienna, where historically female architects weren't being invited to submit proposals. Once women were not only invited to submit proposals, but were also leading this process, it had a significant positive impact on the way cities and housing developments were planned and designed for everybody. By seeking to procure diverse consultants and contractors, this brings a broader range of views and experiences to the way cities are planned and designed and built. This diversity goes beyond gender to include people of different cultures, abilities and backgrounds, and this further assists us to design our towns and cities for everyone. So as these examples illustrate, gender mainstreaming needs to be applied across all functions at both central and local government levels, right through to private developments. This includes policy and strategy, transport services, urban design, public spaces, public safety, funding and budgeting, and many others. The more data we can draw on, particularly from our own towns and cities, the greater position we will be in to make the best planning and design decisions and to be able to justify them. So what can we do? What does this mean for planning and design? As we've seen, planning, policy, strategy and design have a huge impact on the safety, accessibility and inclusivity of our cities. So it's vital that gender mainstreaming practices be incorporated at all levels to enable the positive impacts to flow down to the day-to-day lives of our residents. I propose the following steps to improve the gendered outcomes for all New Zealanders. That we collect additional information to fill gender gaps for the full spectrum of genders. That we incorporate gender mainstreaming into all planning, design and implementation. Explicitly build gender equity into strategies, policies and master plan documents. Develop, implement and promote local gender mainstreaming guidance documents and assessment criteria. Apply a gender lens to funding and prioritising of project delivery. Implement gender budgeting and apply gender lens to funding and prioritising of project delivery. Embed gender equality into procurement processes and policies and decision making and service delivery. And actively educate, advocate and promote gender mainstreaming through all professions. So there's lots that can be done, and it's my belief that embracing gender mainstreaming in all aspects of city planning and design decisions will significantly improve the lives for women and other underrepresented New Zealanders. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your time.